Welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining us for this talk about Agile metrics. My name is Laura Richardson. I run the sales organization for Applied Frameworks. I'm also one of our consulting staff team, although I don't do nearly as much consulting as Joel does. So I'm really happy that Joel Bancroft-Connors can be our kind of expert on the call today. He has spent more time than most people I know really thinking about the concept of metrics and measuring and how that should be applied to the entire organization, right? From teams to product lines and portfolios to the entire enterprise itself. So I think you're all in for a treat today. Joel really is a very thoughtful person on this topic. So Joel, welcome. And maybe you, other than me buttering you up here, maybe you want to say a few extra things about your background and what we're working on today.
Great. Thank you, Laura. I'm going to move the video over because we're going to get started here in a second. Thank you very much, Laura. It's going to be really weird because I'm in presentation mode. I don't have the video, and I love looking at everybody. Again, as Laura said, I'm Joel Bancroft-Connors. I'm a Scrum Alliance certified team coach, and metrics really are a passion of mine. I've been writing about them for years now, practicing, looking at it. Really started at the team level and have since grown to figure out how it goes, because one of the things I've realized, and it's a huge passion with me that is very much connected to the metrics, is that the front line, as it were, and it's not a great term, but the front line of Agile adoptions and Agile transformations has shifted from the teams to the business. The next real area that we need to be working on is expanding product ownership, expanding the connection to the businesses. And this is about, okay, great, we've got good team metrics. How do we use them? What are the good ways to use them? What are the bad ways to use them? Mm-hmm. So that's kind of my background there.
Excellent. So we're recording this. Everyone who's registered will get a copy of the recording along with the ability to download the deck as well. And as we go along, I'll be able to pose some questions to Joel in real time. So if you have some as they come along, please put them into the Q&A. And our commitment to all of you is that it's worth putting your questions in there, even if we don't get to all of them, because we will be answering them in the follow-up email after this. So it's not a wasted effort to stick them in there, because then we know some of the things we can put into our follow-up email when we send it out.
Yeah, all right, absolutely. So every single question will get answered. The answer may be 42, but every single question will be answered.
All right, so Joel, take it away.
All right. So I looked for a really good quote on this to sum this up. If you can't measure something, you can't improve it. And that's something that's very important about why do we need metrics. There's a whole arguments about metrics and are they good or are they evil. At the end of the day, if you want to improve something, you do have to measure it. If you want to know where you are, you need to look on a map. If you want to know how fast you're going, you need to look at your speedometer. Metrics matter. It's how you use them that is the responsibility. So really quickly, what are the 5 principles in summary? It's measure the project, the team, and the Agile adoption separately. Start collecting your metrics early and often. You need to stay focused, you need to be consistent, and then most importantly, you do have to measure responsibly. So let's go ahead and dive into some of these things. First thing I want to do is I'm a huge fan of marketplaces make me smart. Ever since Kai Rizdal and Molly Wood started doing it, I really enjoy doing it. They end their podcast all the time with something of, what's something you thought you knew, but later found out you were wrong about? They ask experts, they ask people. And Laura actually challenged me to this as I was going through this. What's your big assumption that you were wrong about with metrics? And this goes back several years now, but the thing that I was wrong about is that measuring is not about getting to a goal. It's about knowing where you are. And I didn't realize this for the longest time. And then I discovered Goodhart's Law, and it finally really came together for me. When a measure becomes a target, it ceases to be a good measure. This is the English translation of Goodhart's Law. Goodhart is actually an economist, so the actual law is pretty incomprehensible. I like to use an example that I got from a wonderful book called Freakonomics on how metrics can be used wrong. Because metrics can, if you tie metrics to goals, generally that ties to incentive. And incentives can go horribly wrong. In the early 20th century, there was a really large problem with cobras in India. And at the time, the government had a brilliant idea for how to deal with the cobra population. What they did was they offered a bounty on every single cobra head turned into the government. So, I mean, Laura, what do you think would happen in that instance?
Well, of course, my first instinct was wrong, but I'm like, oh, what a fantastic idea that reduce the population and they went extinct, right?
Right. And the problem is that actually was the exact opposite. The cobra population in India exploded. People went, oh, wow, I can make money really easily. I'll start farming cobras. And they started farming cobras. Cobras are really smart, and they would get out of these farms and then they would continue to breed. And suddenly, within a couple of years, the cobra population was even bigger than it was. So that's something you have to be very careful with metrics, is don't use them wrong, or you're going to get what you measure. Okay, we want to measure this. Okay, great. We measured it, and wow, look, we got a lot of cobras now. What are we going to do about that? So let's dive into the principles then on this. One thing I'll say as I go into this, and I think we've got the references to it, I'm going to reference a couple of blogs that I've written. One was written about a month ago, and is a rewrite of an article I wrote 3 years ago, and it's what are 4 good team metrics for measuring. So I'll reference that. And then this talk is also a blog, which is on our website, and we'll share that link at some point. So first principle is measure separately. You need to measure the project, the team, and the adoption separately. Because just because the team is doing great does not mean that your project is on track or that the Agile adoption is sustainable. An analogy I like to use on this is, imagine that you have a team and they need to get to a conference. Problem is, the conference is on the other side of the country and you have to drive. I mean, given today's current climate, you might prefer to drive. And it's like, okay, great, no problem. It's a 3-person team. They figure things out. They set up the schedules for who's going to drive when. They time gas stops and bathroom breaks so that they're not interrupting people's sleep cycles, and that works great. And they get everything. They make it across the country. They have to be there in 2.5 days for the conference. They make it across in record time. They do it in 2 days. They get there and it's like, awesome. And they get out and they look around and go, this is Miami. We're supposed to be in New York. The team measurements were great. Everything was going good. The teams didn't get burned out, but the project wasn't on track. They were going in the completely wrong direction. And then on top of that, they didn't pay attention to the car. The tires were bald. The oil pan was dry. The engine wouldn't start. And so they couldn't get to New York in the half a day they had remaining because they didn't sustain the Agile adoption. So the drivers of the team, the trip is the project, and the car is the Agile adoption. And if you aren't measuring each of those in their own turn, if you try and just focus on one, the other ones will suffer, and you can't do them together. So let me give you a couple of examples of this, of what to measure and what not to measure. When it comes to team, again, we have an entire blog devoted to this. We also have a spreadsheet that that you can use to actually track these metrics with your team. So for team, it's tied to cycle time, which basically equates to productivity. How much productivity do we have in the team or the organization? Escape defects, which directly relates to quality. Plan to done, which relates to predictability. And then happiness, which relates to health and the overall stability and engagement of the organization. At the project or product level, you want to start shifting to value-based metrics. Here, you want to be looking really at stuff, and something to think about is there's that term called pirate metrics: acquisition, activation, retention, referral. Does this actually mean something? So we suggest things like tracking to revenue, cost savings. Business value plan to done is actually a really great one. Net promoter and fit for purpose, which more track your customer satisfaction. And then for adoption, the 2 areas we talk about, we think are really good for adoption, are large-scale retrospectives and organizational assessments. A couple of things about adoption. is if you are using assessment tools, make sure you use good research or survey practices in creating your assessment tool. For example, you want to use test retest, inter-rater reliability, internal and external validity, and the like. A good example of an Agile assessment tool that has done these scientific-based structures to build their assessments is a company called Comparative Agility. We at Applied Frameworks think they're doing a great job, and we use them when we can. However, if you build an assessment internally, think about these scientific factors for building your assessments. Another thing is, if you are a certified Scrum Master through the Scrum Alliance, you have access to Comparative Agility's Scrum Master Personal Improvement Tool. You go into your dashboard and it's on the right-hand side. It's actually kind of structured as, how are the Scrum events, Scrum artifacts, Scrum roles doing in it. So that's something you can check out what Comparative Agility looks like.
So Joel, one of the questions that's kind of relevant to this right now is like about the frequency of kind of the adoption type metrics. And, you know, there's certainly companies that, you know, frequency for them, I think might mean once every 6 months, just because at the moment they're not doing it at all. Right. But talk a little bit about maybe your favorite way of doing some of these adoption type metrics. And then what's the cadence that you find effective?
Right. So for the team level, you need to do it at the sprint or iteration. If your teams are running in Kanban, don't do it any less than once a month. Because again, it's the concept of transparency, inspection, and adaptation. The shorter your feedback loop, the shorter you can make a response. And so that the principles of the 3 pillars of Scrum, transparency, inspection, and adaptation, really apply to your metrics as well. For project and product, you're going to be wanting to tie to every sprint. You should be able to tie to how much business value have we generated, and at the very least, every release. If you're releasing every quarter, you should be looking at your net promoter based on the releases. Honestly, if you're releasing every quarter, you should be looking every month. If you're releasing every 6 months, you should be looking every 2 months. If you're releasing every year, look every quarter. Never go more than a quarter without looking. Same thing applies to your adoption metrics. I recommend doing large-scale retrospectives once a quarter. Just make them a regular part of your cadence. If your organization is too big to do that, there are a couple of different ways to do this. One is Laura will be putting out a blog on large-scale retrospectives on how to do it, how to make it easy. The other thing is, if you still even have too large an organization, do statistical sampling, and every quarter pick a statistical cross-section of the organization and do retrospectives with them. So that's kind of the timing, but at the end, I would never go more than a quarter without measuring in every single one of these categories.
Mm-hmm. And then again, before we move on, you've mentioned the done to planned, plan to done ratio. In the Q&A, there's a question in there from Ken. Can you say a little bit more about what he's asking here? And if you can click the Q&A, I don't know if you can see his question.
Yeah, let me go click on that. Ken, done to planned. I'm not sure I understand, but yeah, plan to done. Let me show you in the next slide. I actually have an example of the team metrics and results of it. So that might help.
Maybe in the same context, Joel, of talking about that one, velocity has also come up as a question, and it's, you know, velocity, we always talk about that from a consulting standpoint, that is a tool that is really only for teams to be using to estimate how much work they can get done. And one team's velocity of, I'm making up a number here, but say it's 30, might be somebody else's 50. And the idea really behind velocity is that it's always apples to oranges to onions, right? It's never the same across every team.
Right. So my comment about velocity is essentially velocity is based on team estimates, and team estimates are nothing more than a group fiction put together to figure out how big things are, so they can figure out how much they can take onto the sprint. Velocity is looking at how much they've taken on. It is 100% a planning measure. It is for the team to look at and use it when they are looking in their sprint planning to figure out how much they can do. We've got a velocity of 50. That might be a good guideline. That doesn't mean that you never do more than 50. It means here's a guideline, guys. And a good scrum master, if the team decides to go, okay, we're going to do 100 points, a good scrum master might start asking questions. Hey guys, we've never done more than a 50. How are you comfortable? How do you feel about that? And the team may go, yeah, we're absolutely there. It's a planning measure though. We'll talk later about better ways. Using team level velocity to figure out when you're going to get done isn't good. It's much better to do historical based planning. So velocity, you need to be careful with it. And again, the team level, it's strictly for how much can the team take on in the next sprint. I noticed something about happiness. Happiness can be subjective. I recommend, and it's in it. I reference it in the Team Metrics blog. It's the CRISPR index or the happiness index, and it's about regularly polling on your team for happiness and then looking at the histographs over time. It's a bit of a, it's actually one of the only leading indicators in the team level, because you could have your cycle time and your escape defect and your plan done all look awesome, but if the happiness score of the team is going down, it's very likely they're headed for a crash.
So Joel, we just had a little minor success here. I need to point out, I was typing an answer to the happiness question at the same time you were answering it, and we aligned.
Well, that's good. That's good.
Isn't that good? Yeah. No, it really, it's true, right? It's subjective, and what my happiness, how I measure my happiness is different than Joel would, how he would measure his. But really what we're looking at is, what does that look like over time across the same people you continually ask the question to? And I think your next slide, Joel, probably talks about, well, where does that, why would you want to look at happiness? At what point would it matter to leadership and team? And I know actually we'll get there in a minute, but
yeah,
at
it's
some
the next
point
slide
that one becomes a nice part of your dashboard. It becomes important.
Yes, absolutely. So next principle is start early. It's collect your Agile metrics early and often. And we already talked about how often it is, but it's the principle around there are two principles. One is it's really hard to know where you are if you don't know where you started. And the next is, by collecting early and often, you start to get solid trends and you start to get data as opposed to estimates that allow you to know where or when will you or can we be done. So what I want to do is I want to show, this is examples. You'll actually see this in the template spreadsheet that we have. This, however, is data from a real team I worked with back in 2015. And this was tracking their data over time. And so as you can see, we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 sprints. That's 14 weeks worth of data. And you can see when I first started working with these teams, they had a cycle time of around 13 days for an individual product backlog. That's longer than their sprints. They had 2-week sprints, so that it was taking them more than a sprint to get something done on average. Their plan to done, this team was actually better than some. Most of the teams in the organization had a plan to dones in the 30%. However, as they started tracking and becoming aware of this, and they were understood these metrics, they started to understand the value of getting to done during a sprint, and their plan to done metric went up. Escape defects also, as they started paying more attention to things and focusing, the escape defects went down. Part of this is because the reason why they had such high cycle times was they kept getting interrupted. Having these metrics gave us the visibility to let leadership to start to make some decisions on how to change how the teams were being impacted during a sprint. And then we have the team happiness. When I first started working with the teams, they were we're just kind of coasting along. They'd been doing Agile for 3 months before I joined, and then this reflects the next almost 3 months, the next 3 months after I joined. The big thing you'll notice is with the happiness is there's a dip there. The dip is actually when two team members left the team and they got 2 new team members. And if you then look, there was actually a corresponding small rise in cycle time, and there was a small dip in the productivity during that time because of the impact of this. However, because we have the happiness and because we know what caused the happiness, when leadership went, well, why did the cycle time go up? They're absorbing 2 new team members, and it's taking time to bring those people up to speed.
what I like about this, Joel, is that it really is that dashboard perspective on trying to understand as sometimes the Scrum Master, sometimes that particular business leader, asking that question about, okay, what can I see here and how can I help improve things? Right? Like
Right.
what is it that might be an impediment that I have some influence over that I can help the team in order to have these dashboard metrics continue to track in the right direction.
And so these are the team level metrics. And I think of team level metrics, the purpose of a team level metrics is to help the health of the team. What can the team do to improve its overall capability to deliver in a sustainable manner? We can also do the same thing with business value. And this is actually taken straight from a scaled Agile slide, and it talks about program predictability measures. Scaled Agile is one of the practices that uses the plan to done with business value. So they assign business value to the stuff being worked on in a release. The stakeholders actually assign the business value, and then that allows the teams to then know how they're doing towards delivering the value that the organization cares about. And here we have a comparison of two different teams. Team A is doing well. It's actually managing to deliver, whereas Team A was falling below the predicted and has a less control on its development cycles. Doing this helps. Go ahead, Laura.
Yeah, I was just going to say it's a nice way of providing that the organization is appropriately looking at what business value really means, right? It doesn't mean a particular specific feature, right? Because then you end up getting in trouble again, like you're measuring the wrong kind of thing. I mean, if you look at the SAFE article, what they're really talking about is it has to not be a prescriptive business value, right? It's, for example, reduce process time by 50%. It's not a specific feature about how that's going to happen. So the team has a lot of autonomy about how they're going to achieve that particular business value, that particular business goal. And they can also tell based on assigned business value of the things that they are going to be working on in that program increment, which ones are more important than others, right? So there's some inherent understanding from the team about what's the most important thing they might be working on for that particular program increment for the business, right? It's not about complexity or how long it's going to take. It's about how much value does it bring the business when it's completed. So I think what's interesting about this is, teams have a lot of control over how much they can put into a particular program increment, how things are described, and at the end, the business is what assigns the actual value. So it's really, again, it's focusing on value rather than on metrics that mislead the team to be potentially working on the wrong kinds of things. So SAFE says the target is between 80 and 100% of what you want to deliver every program increment. And I think for the most part, teams that are used to working this way and getting good at it, that's kind of that blue line where teams will pretty much stay within there. New teams will struggle, right? And that's expected. Where this becomes kind of interesting is if you have success trends over a period of time and then something happens where one or two or all teams really dip way below what you're normally seeing, that's when it really becomes important to figure out, well, what changed, right? What happened? What thing? Is it explainable, right? Is it something like COVID hit and everything we thought we were working on and what we were doing was instantly no longer relevant and we really had to pivot? So the business value we thought we wanted to deliver had to shift, right? We would expect to see a dip and that would be totally fine, right? Sometimes you don't expect to see that dip and then you need to start digging into what's going on, what might have happened and how might we reflect on this and in the inspect and adapt phase. Is there something we can do to be better?
Yeah, and one thing it's about the early and often, an example from my pre-Agile days, that was a long time ago, is I worked on a project, and it was a cross-company project. I represented the global support organization, and we were working with two other major departments on a certain project, and I was the project manager, and I realized early on that there were some issues here, there were some team issues, and there were some challenges, and I started creating a report on day one, and I updated that report twice a week, every single week, which meant when the project finally went off the rails and it actually was specifically because one team member basically refused to do anything that they were assigned to. There was no, there was no surprise, and B, there was no, oh, you threw that person under a bus. It's like, no, we've been tracking this from the very beginning. You don't track a project in the last quarter of the cycle. You track what you're doing every single sprint, and that creates the trends that allow you to make good data decisions. Which comes to the next one. Not a lot here. It's just limit your measures to 3 to 5 items. If you measure too many things at once, it's like working on too many things at once. Multitasking, nothing will get measured well. If you have 10 measures, you have a couple of things. One is some of those measures aren't going to get measured well or paid attention to right. Also, if you've got a large organization, maybe this department is paying attention to metrics 1 through 3, and this department's paying attention to metrics 7 through 10, and nobody's paying attention to metrics 4, 5, and 6. Measure what matters, focus on it, and then move on. At the team level, I recommend those 14 metrics. They are really solid. 3 of those are based on recommendations from Jeff Sutherland, the founder of Scrum. The plan to done is something I added in over time and found to be really effective. At the product level, I recommend 1 value-based, 1 customer-based. So business value and net promoter, or cost savings and fit to purpose. Figure out what's the right thing. And then for the Agile adoption itself, I go with the retrospective rule. And that's when you hold a retrospective, pick 1 or 2 items that you're going to improve. The goal of the adoption metrics is so that you can identify the things you want to improve. If you come back with a list of 15 things from a large scale retrospective, you don't try and fix all 15 of them. You then go into some way of doing decision-making, participatory budgeting, some kind of prioritization, pick the top 2 things that you care about, create projects around those and resolve them, then go back and look again. Don't try and do them all at once. And then number 4 is be consistent. So the concept of being consistent here is teams are working on the same product, need to be using the same measures, or you will literally have apples and oranges. This also, by being consistent, allows aggregation of metrics to see larger trends across the organization. An example I have is back in a while ago, I worked for AOL back when they still existed, and I was working in the video advertising division. We had 10 teams working on the selling platform for selling video ads. Some of those teams were Scrum, some of those teams were Kanban. And we wanted the leadership to be able to have a good view. First off, you don't want leaders to be focusing in on an individual team, because that's not healthy, that's not valuable. So the first thing we did was we started aggregating things. So these 4 teams were all working from the same product backlog. When we reported to management, we just aggregated those 4 teams together, and here is the demand plan to done. Here is the demand team's escape defects. Here is the demand team's overall happiness score. That's what leadership needed to know. And then we also having that same consistency, it allowed us to look across the organization, even though some of the teams were doing Scrum and some of the teams were doing Kanban. We created an artificial time box for measurement of 1 month for the Kanban teams. The Scrum teams were operating in 2 weeks, and we processed the metrics data by week. So if on average the Scrum teams were running 2 defects per sprint and the Kanban teams were running 4 defects per sprint, what that translated to and what got reported to the VP of engineering was, on average right now we have 1 defect per team per week. And that was the data that he could look at and he could understand. That's why you need that consistency. You don't need it across the entire enterprise. It should be based on the products, because you might have an internal IT project that isn't tied to revenue, and you're going to want to measure its product success differently than you would the product that you're selling out to the customer.
You know, Joel, I think there's an interesting question here that I want to address, because there is some nuance here about not comparing team to team, right? That is an anti-pattern. And my first example to that has to do with velocity again, where comparing team to team by saying, oh, each team should be achieving 30 velocity measurement of 30, and team A does it and team B doesn't, that's an anti-pattern, right? It's a misuse of first a metric and comparing teams in a punitive kind of way, and also in a goal-oriented way.
Right. I had I worked with 2 teams when I was at AOL. They both were working on the exact same product backlog. They had the same product owner. One team had an average story size of 13 points. One team had an average story size of 5 points. So one of the teams regularly had a velocity that was much higher. Also, even if you're just looking at the items, and one team regularly got 10 items done, one team regularly got 6 items done. But when you dug in, it's like, well, the team getting the 6 items were working on the more gnarly problems, as opposed to the team that wasn't, which is why I don't recommend velocity. I look at cycle time, and it's more about where is the trend and where is it going. Part of the reason why you want to be consistent is you get to see those trends. If this team has got a steady cycle time of 7 days, okay, great. That's important. If that team's cycle time suddenly jumps to 25 days, that's where you go, okay, is there something going on? Can we help you? Mm-hmm. And you can always go, it's like the team should always want to, okay, what can we do to reduce our cycle time? But if their cycle time is consistent, that's what's important. That's the most important thing. Yeah, making the cycle time go down, yes. The more your cycle time goes down, the more productivity you're going to have. But different teams and such are going to have difference. You're looking at the trends, not the individual data points.
Yeah, and I think another way to think about it is, in that scaled agile safe example, the goal is that 80 to 100% of the business value is regularly delivered by teams during a program increment. But how much value each team takes on is not consistent, right? It is something that the team determines, can we sign up for this level of work? And it's a negotiated thing. And so when you take a look at what's actually being compared, it's not, every team signed up for 50 points of business value. It's the team itself says, yes, this is what we can deliver. So we're looking at the trend of percentage across teams, but every team is working on a different size number of business value based on what makes most sense. Right, so it is nuanced. Yes, don't compare team to team in that precise kind of way, but I think it is a valuable thing from a art or a leadership perspective to look at trends across teams over time, just knowing that they're working on different things and they're using different team metrics or team measures. And so the specifics are not comparable, but the trends are.
Right, absolutely. All right. So let's go on to, let's end strong with the 5th principle. Whoops. So measure responsibility. I summed this up with 2 quotes. The first quote is from Eli Goldrake, who wrote The Goal, which is a fundamental book on lean that if you haven't read, you should. If you don't want to read that one because it's more manufacturing focused and you're more software minded, read the Phoenix Project, which is basically the software version of The Goal. Tell me how you measure me and I will tell you how I will behave. And then the follow on to that is from the leadership perspective. Where there is great power, there is great responsibility. Metrics have power, and if you don't use them well, they're going to not give you anything. So responsible measuring. What do you do? What do you don't do? In responsible measuring, do look forward. Metrics are mostly lagging indicators. You don't use them to analyze the past performance. You use them to plan the future. For example, you look at, okay, in the last 6 months, we have an average delivery of 4 epics per month. Therefore, looking at the next 6 months, it looks like we could deliver 12 epics. And again, there are different sizes and everything, and you can go into that, and there are different ways to do that. But just if we look at it, it's like, okay, we 12 epics. So then you go to the business. What 12 epics would you like to deliver? It's not hey, you only delivered 12 epics. It's like, okay, you delivered 12 epics. Let's use that to plan to the future. Our cycle time is steady and consistent at 8 days right now. Okay, great. Let's add a specific thing to our next Agile adoption retrospective on looking at why cycle time is high, and maybe we can find a way to reduce that by looking at organizational systemic issues. Supporting metrics. interlocking metrics reveal better data and are harder to influence. Part of the reason I have the 4 team metrics the way they are is they create an interlocking mesh. If a team decides to game the system and they crash their cycle time, it's almost impossible for the escape defects to not reflect, oh, look, they crashed their cycle time, because their escape defects will shoot up. And then finally, even if they're managing to get the three outcome-based metrics, cycle time, escape defect, and plan to done, if the happiness metric drops, you know that maybe they're being pressured too much by the organization and they're doing great, but they're burning out. So they're interlocking supporting metrics. With product level, that's one of the reasons why I recommend tracking both a value-based or a revenue-based measure and a customer success one. Because you could be selling like hotcakes, but ticking off all of your customers so that the next release, you don't sell anything. And then the final do is, again, it's customer focused. Measure the product and product using the value-based measures. We talked about that again. It's revenue, cost savings, business value plan to done, net promoter, fit for purpose. On the don't side, per the question, don't measure team against team. It's an apples to oranges comparison. Any measurement of team against team is impossible because no team is working on the exact same stories with the exact same skills from the exact same backlog. Step back and look at the aggregate data. The only people that should be looking at the individual team data is the team itself in their own retrospective. After that, back up and start looking at product lines or departments and look at the trends at that level. Don't react too quickly. One of the things I see time and time again in new Agile launches is the team goes in, they have the first sprint, and it's an absolute disaster and failure, and leadership freaks out. It's like, well, yeah, congratulations, you just started something new. Where the first time you picked up a baseball and tried to hit it with a bat, how good were you at it? One data point does not a trend make. You want at least 3 sprints worth of data before you start making any decisions. Same thing goes with the when are you going to be done. If you're starting a new project and they say, when are you going to be done? You can go, hey, based on our estimate, we think we'll be done in 12 weeks. And when we're done with the first 2 sprints, we'll actually have a better idea. By the time we get done with the 3rd sprint, we'll actually be able to tell you probably very reliably when we're going to get done. And that ties to the last one, which is don't forecast with estimates. You want to use empirical data to forecast, not team level data. Empirical data are things like looking at how much did we deliver as an organization last release. Find some way to measure that, or even step to the next level and go to statistical based forecasting, such as Monte Carlo forecasting. There's a wonderful Agilist based out of Seattle, Troy McGinnis, who has a Monte Carlo system, Monte Carlo forecasting system for Agile that with 3 cycle time data points can generate about 70 to 80% accuracy in when you'll be done or how long it will take you to be. So that responsible measuring, I think, I'm gonna look at my previews. So that's kind of the overview. We've got
well, we do have a couple questions.
Yeah,
we do have a couple questions that we could take, Joel. So one of them, let's see. Tilly asks, how do you best measure and report defects if some defects are more critical than others, right? So talk about the value maybe that you have found in looking at it as an overall metric, and that perhaps is a little bit different than taking a look at, well, philosophically, how do teams think about definition of done, stop ship, right, critical, or things that are acceptable within the realm of trade-offs between meeting deadlines and what is done look like, right? So maybe you can talk a little bit more about that.
The first thing is, part of this is a moving your organization more to Agile. Part of the problem is a lot of defects that are out there, they're not defects. They're things that should be going.
Well, I don't know if we really lost Joel or if it's just me that's lost Joel here, but I think where he's going is, oh, Joel, are you back? Yeah, you just froze for a minute, but you were talking about you know, how an organization thinks about what a defect or a bug is and what it isn't.
Right. Part of this is we've set for 30, 40 years, we've set up an adversarial relationship between the test organizations and the development organizations. You literally, it's like you're incentivizing the test people to find problems, you're incentivizing the developers to ship product, creates a natural conflict. So the first thing, really look at what is a bug, and is it really a bug or is it an enhancement request? Remember, everything goes into the backlog. No matter what it is, it goes in the product backlog, and the owner prioritizes it. Based on that, then you know what it is. And the next thing is, where are you measuring? If you're in the middle of a sprint, the developer writes some code, goes over and asks, and the developer asks utility, hey, can you look at this? And you find a problem, that's not a bug. That is a task to be completed to meet the definition of done. That's why we're tracking escape defects. And the definition of escape defect is anything found after the sprint has ended. Because at that point, the team has met the definition of done. Everybody on the team, including the test people involved in the team, have said, this is done, we don't see any issues. So you're tracking what work do we have to fix afterwards. And there's a very real cost to this, and part of why we do this. A research study done with Jeff Sutherland and Microsoft found that on average, it took 24 times the amount of time it took to write the feature in the first place to fix it if it was discovered in production in the wild. So something that took 1 day to write takes 24 days to fix. So that's why escape defects matter. Yes, you can measure escape defects by criticality, and you can have, okay, we had 4 severity 1 escape defects and 5 severity 2 escape defects, and so that's important. However, be very, very sure that you have very, very clear written definitions of what constitutes a severity. For example, on another AOL example, I seem to be using a lot of those today, the teams were getting pummeled by severity 1 defects from the business, and it was constantly interrupting the sprints, and we couldn't.
You know, yeah, actually, Jordan asked if we're going to share the deck, and yes, we are. And yeah, Joel's internet connection is having a real problem here, so I'm going to take over from him. Joel, if you can hear me, when you come back in here, why don't you just pause your video, and that might reduce kind of the load on your bandwidth at the moment. But we'll let Joel finish answering his questions when he pops back. But Jordan also asked a really interesting one, I think, which is in chat, he said that he gets pushback from the dev team sometimes because they don't have control over the revenue measures or the value measures that might be really valuable to look at. For example, the dev team doesn't actually sell, right? So they're not responsible for the revenue that comes in. I think that if they're feeling that that's how they're being measured in terms of, hey, all of a sudden somehow they're going to be responsible for sales numbers, I think maybe they're misunderstanding how to use that. Right. I mean, what we're really looking at from a product standpoint is the product that's being developed meeting the needs of the market and the customers? And that's a product management and portfolio management and business value, understanding business value kind of issue that the dev team should be pulled into, right? It's a conversation and an understanding about what's most valuable to the market, and then how is the market responding to the solution that we're delivering. And so it's not that they become responsible for the sales numbers, but they start to use, are we building the right thing as being part of that conversation about how do we prioritize what we're working on. So I think it's really helpful for the development team to have direct control over how hard is it to build something, right? How complex is a particular capability or a particular feature? But the business stakeholders are the ones that own the other, dimension. If you use kind of an XY graph to plot these things, the way that I'm used to doing holding those conversations is the development team controls the x-axis, how hard is it to build something, and the business stakeholders or the business team or the customer proxies, they manage the y-axis, right? How important is this to the business? How valuable is this? So you get this nice intersection of understanding, hey, the value on one particular capability or feature might be really high and the complexity is low. So now the business understands how hard it is to build, and the development team understands how important it is. And then on the flip side, you might have something that is really hard to build and the value is relatively low. And it's amazing how often the business and the engineering team make assumptions that are incorrect about both of those two axes, because obviously that's not your expertise. And so as a business stakeholder, I have so often decided that something must be, really easy to build, and it's not, or my dev team will assume that something's super important in reality compared to everything else it's not. So that's how I typically use those, those measures is just to really have some relative understanding of everything that we could do, where's the value and where's the complexity. And Joel, I think you might be back now. So you were just about—
Can you hear me?
Yep, I can hear you. And you were just about to talk about another AOL story, so.
Right, well, I didn't miss anything. Fortunately, I heard you guys all the whole time. I could hear you, you just couldn't hear me. I'm trying to, your answer on the business value versus the level of effort, just a great answer. I absolutely +1 that one. Can you remind me what?
Yeah, you were talking about escape
was?
defects. I think you were talking about escape defects. Yeah, and you were pretty close to the end of that one, but I can't remember if you had a point either that you hadn't quite finished making. If anyone else remembers what they were really hoping Joel was about to say, you can stick it into chat. Otherwise, sorry about that.
Yeah, so if you've got, again, any questions that don't get answered, we will answer them there. So I think maybe we go on to the next question.
Okay, so we did talk a lot about cycle time. Let's see if Steve's question is fully answered here. So he asks, how valuable is cycle time if the size of work items are variable and possibly in a wide range? Is the assumption that work items are relatively sized?
So cycle time is still valuable over time, because the thing is, when you first start measuring cycle time, you're going to have moving measures of what you're looking at. The first goal of a team is, can we get our cycle time down to fit so that it's less than 10 days? Because for the average sprint is 2 weeks. Can we get the cycle time to less than 10 days? That's the first goal. The next goal is, can we get the cycle time down to 4 to 5 days? The reason for this is, if you get done with something, then you're going to show it to the product owner, and the product owner goes, yeah, that's not what I wanted. If you've got a cycle time of 8 days, you're not going to get that item done in the sprint. If you've got a cycle time of 4 to 5 days, you're going to get that item done in the sprint. After that, the real holy grail is, can you get your cycle time down to one to 2 days? Because if you get to 1 to 2 days, you don't even have to task stuff anymore, because you've broken the stuff down small enough. And what this is it's about encouraging teams to break things down into smaller chunks. And you're going to start to find that by looking at cycle time, you'll start looking at the things and going, wow, that's huge. Can we break that down into smaller pieces of value and get better understanding?
Yeah, I think there's that topic will be talked about even in more detail the next webinar that we do. I'm about to send an announcement out for the scheduling of Kim Peremsky, who's going to join me next month to talk about vertical story slicing and story writing and story slicing in general. And I can't tell you, actually, we should have put a poll in here, although I didn't expect to want to answer that question, but I hear it from most people that they find that to be the most difficult thing to feel really good at, is story writing and story slicing and simplifying, right? That seems to be the most difficult thing, or takes the longest to feel really competent at that. So if I'd love to hear it, stick it in chat. How many of you felt that same way, and anything else you want to put in there, or any other questions you've got? We still have a few more minutes to answer those.
Yeah. So one's a follow-up question. We measure in-sprint defects, and anonymous. For me, it's because there is no defect. The thing about the definition of done, you have two binary states with a product backlog item. You have done and not done. Until the item is done, it's not broken. A defect implies something is broken. Until something's done, it's not broken. It's just not done. I'm digging a hole to put in a post, because we just built a chicken run out on our pasture, and I'm digging a post, and I look to my wife, who is the product owner. Let's just be frank. I'm the development team for our property. My wife is the product owner. I look to my wife, the product owner, and I go, hey, am I done? And she looks and goes, yeah, it still needs to go down about 2 more inches. that's not a bug. That's I'm not done. So I dig it 2 more inches. If a developer shows something to the test, or you run a test and it fails, that just shows I have not. It is not working yet. It kind of goes to the Thomas Edison quote of the, I haven't failed. I found 1,000 ways that it doesn't work. And so, and then the next part of it is it's that whole team thing. You're trying to get rid of the adversarial relationship. The goal is for tests to help the developers to deliver better quality code, not to say, oh, you missed something, you missed a spot. And so that's why there are no defects in a sprint. There is another task. You would add it. So for example, if we were using Jira, I advise teams don't file a defect. If you as a tester find something, create a subtask, assign it to the developer who was working on that coding task.
I think Tilly has a follow-up question here about how do you measure that type of cycling?
Okay, I'm sorry. How do you measure that?
Yeah, Tilly might have to say a little bit more about what you're getting at here, but we'll see if Tilly adds more color to that question.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then let's see. Gordon asked a question: what measure do you use to describe an overall effective performance of the Agile development organization at a higher level? So we're actually working on a blog directly around that one of how do you measure the value and such, and we'll probably create a future webinar on that. At the high level, start with the what's in it for me, or what do I care about? What does a CEO care about? Turns out actually one of the biggest things CEOs care about, and I got this Mike Kottmeyer, who is the CEO of a friendly rival competitor of ours, has written down questions he's asked CEOs for a long, long time. And when he asks them, what do you care about most? One of the #1 things that comes back is predictability. Turns out that a CEO doesn't care as much about what he's going to get if he knows that every month I'm going to get a release and it's going to be rock solid quality. Because if he knows every month or every 3 months he's going to get a release, that's predictability. You can take predictability to the bank. So that's one thing. Then it's the going back to the value, and you start looking at what is the net promoter score? What is the, and it comes right back to revenue. It's like, okay, great, we shipped this. How much money are we making?
Yeah, and another question here is the difference between a bug and a defect. You know, the textbook answer, right, is a defect is something that gets shipped that doesn't meet the customer's needs, and a bug is something that doesn't work. You know, we could probably have a whole webinar about that one actually, but I tend to think about is this ties into some of the metrics that Joel was originally talking about, which is if you can get your cycle time to be shorter and you increase your interaction time with the business stakeholders, the idea that you would actually have something that works perfectly, meets your definition of done, and does not meet the customer need goes down. Right, so that is the reason why we want to have a lot of business stakeholder involvement in the process of building good software, right?
And I just put into chat my general guideline on that of what I talk to test organizations about when I'm consulting with them. Did we get more definition from Tilly?
I think so. Let's see. Tilly says, how many times do you have to dig an additional 2 inches? Meaning, how do you measure that type of cycling? How many times do you have to dig an additional 2 inches for your
Yeah, it's I don't measure that because again, then you're starting to get into that specifics of the how of the team, and it's like that's for the team to self-police. If and it comes out in the retrospective. If the team realizes that it takes them 5 passes through the build system and testing for every product backlog item, they're going to figure that out. The cycle time, maybe their cycle time is 5 days, but it's taking multiple passes through tests. They're going to decide, is that painful or not? From the organizational level, it's kind of one of those things is if you've got 2 teams and both teams have got a cycle time of 5 days, one team goes through a build test cycle 5 times and one team goes through it 2 times. As a leader, you don't care. Cycle time is 5 days for both. Okay, great. And cycle time is stable. This is that part of the Agile principle of give the teams the tools, the environment, and the support they need
and then get out of their way and trust them.
Yeah, and then I think this will be, we'll dig into this a little deeper when we talk about enterprise retrospectives, but what we might find when you ask periodically all teams to talk about what are the things that they find that slows them down or they find frustrating or that impact their either productivity or their ability to be accurate, like their accuracy, what we might uncover is that the impediment that exists for that team to improve that area might actually not be within their scope of control, right? What we might start to see is that there's a whole DevOps effort ongoing that might need more resources or might need to be prioritized differently. And so some of the things that teams are running into, they don't have scope of control over to address, right? So this is, again, kind of gets back to Joel's original kind of recommendation, is that it is a dashboard of things that are being measured independently, because there are some interesting cause and effect things that you can start to see when you focus in on a smaller set of metrics at each of the three levels, at the team, at the product, and at the enterprise. And sometimes the things that the teams are struggling with isn't always apparent unless you're also looking at it from the enterprise perspective as well, right? So I think that's a good example of how do we build software without problems or bugs or defects, and it might be within the team scope of control to improve that, or there might be a larger kind of DevOps tooling project that needs to be green lighted or initiated, or in some cases just expanded.
So I want to give a quick plug because we're wrapping up. Yeah. We do lots of consulting. We also do training in this time of COVID. All of our certification programs are available through live online. I am actually teaching a class next week. It is set on West Coast hours, so it'll be 9:30 to 1:30, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday of next week. We also have a ton of other classes, some on East Coast hours, some on West Coast hours. If you're interested in joining that class next week, you can use the discount code Frameworks100 and you get a $100 discount off of it. And then, as Laura said, I'm going to go through all of these questions. We're going to go through it. As I mentioned to Christine, we're also going to tap into some of the knowledge and wisdom of the other consultants at Applied Frameworks to give you really good answers on all of these questions.
Dipti asked if we do Agile coaching. Yes, we do. You can reply to the email that I sent you all for the invitation, and half of our business is about Agile coaching and consulting, and the other half is the training side. And you know what? You don't even have to hire us to ask a question. So if you have other questions that are related to metrics and you just didn't think about it until after this was over, please just email them to me. And as long as you do that on the next day or two, we'll incorporate it into our response. But we want to be
absolutely
a strong, solid resource for the community here. So anything that you can send to us ahead of time, we will incorporate it in what we kind of reply out. And I'm going to put my
we start every
here.
Yeah. We start when people call us and say, hey, we want to hire you for training or consulting or whatever, we start with a conversation. And I'll be honest, I'd say probably a good 10% of those conversations are, oh, well, you know what? Hey, just, you don't need us. Here are some things to try. Go try those, and then come back and let us know when. Here's when I think where I think you might need help. But right now, this is great. And we have a long-standing relationship with a lot of our past clients that'll just reach out to us and go, hey, you got a half an hour? Can I talk with you? And we're always happy to help our folks. We really, for me personally, it's part of my own mantra. I am an Agile consultant and an Agile coach because I believe that by helping individuals, I help projects to be better. Better projects lead to better products lead to more successful companies, and more successful companies can and do change the world. And so I literally am doing this job that I love because I want to change the world for the better. So happy to help in any way I can.
Well, I just want to thank everybody for joining. And like I said, we'll be following up with an email. And yeah, carry on with the rest of your day, and happy Wednesday, everybody. Actually, it's Thursday. Oh my God, happy Thursday.
Yeah, happy Thursday. Actually, sorry. Anybody wants to do this real quick? There is the URL to my class and to the discount code.
Do you want to stick that into the chat just in case people are still hanging out?
Yes, I did. Yes, I just did.
Got it. Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you, everybody, and we'll hopefully see you in our next webinar.
Yeah, thank you all. It was a blast.